The snow had stopped falling 3 days ago, but the silence it left behind was the loudest thing Aldrich Pence had ever heard. He stood at the edge of what had been Main Street. Though the street itself had ceased to exist in any meaningful way sometime during the second night of the blizzard, the drifts rose above his shoulders in places sculpted into pale ridges by winds that had screamed down from the mountains with the focused intention of something that had been waiting all year for exactly this moment. The buildings of Greystone, those proud wooden structures with their straight lines and their painted facades and their iron stoves, sat buried to their window sills. 2 of them had no roofs anymore. The spaces where those roofs had been were open to the white sky, raw and empty like wounds. He had his hat in his hands. He did not know when he had taken it off. His eyes moved up the slope of the scorched, the barren hill to the south of town. That no one had ever wanted the hill everyone in Greystone had spent 30 years dismissing as useless ground, as cracked earth, good for nothing and no one. His eyes moved up that slope and found what he had been avoiding looking at since the storm broke. A thin thread of smoke pale against the blue sky rising from a chimney that should not have been there. Rising steady and unhurried the way smoke rises from a fire that has been burning all night without difficulty and intends to go on burning. He had called it a tomb. He had stood on that hillside in October and delivered the word like a verdict, his voice carrying the full weight of his office, and his certainty, and the woman who lived there had nodded slowly and turned back to her work, as if he had said something mildly interesting but not particularly relevant. He had walked back down the hill feeling like a man who had dispensed justice and was mildly irritated that the recipient had not seemed sufficiently affected by it. Now he was holding his hat in his hands in front of what remained of his town. From the chimney on the scorch, smoke rose, steady, unhurried, alive. He started walking toward the hill. To understand why Aldrich Pence had done what he did, you had to go back to August. You had to go back to the heat and the particular kind of grief that a man carries when he has lost the person who made sense of everything, and when he has decided that the only way to survive that loss is to build something permanent in the place where the absence lives. Eleanor Pence had died in the spring of 1901. Pneumonia, swift and merciless, the way it takes the ones who seem too alive to die of it. She had been 51 years old, and she had run the mayor's household and half the civic life of Greystone with the quiet competence of someone who did not need to announce what they were doing because the results spoke clearly enough. When she was gone, the results stopped speaking. The household went quiet. The civic meetings went longer and accomplished less. Aldrich Pence went through his days with the mechanical efficiency of a man who has learned to perform the functions of living without any particular investment in the outcome. He needed something to build. He needed something to point at and say, here is the shape of what I am trying to do with the time that remains. The plot at the end of Cedar Street was the last parcel in Greystone that did not yet belong to the town's expansion plan. He had been working toward it for 2 years, property by property, negotiating and acquiring and redirecting, building the footprint of a new civic center that would anchor the southern end of Main Street and make Greystone into the kind of town that people drove through and remembered. In the center of that civic center and the design he had commissioned from an architect in Denver, there would be a memorial garden. There would be a bench. There would be Eleanor's name carved in stone. The plot at the end of Cedar Street was where Wren Callum had lived for 30 years. Wren Callum was 67 years old. She was small in the way that certain older women are small, not diminished, but concentrated, as if the years had pressed everything that was unnecessary out of her and left only the essential material. She had gray hair that she wore pinned back without vanity or ceremony. And she had hands that told the story of a life spent doing actual work. And she had eyes the color of the sky just before a weather change, that particular watchful gray-blue that belonged to people who had learned to read the world carefully. She had come to Greystone in 1872 as a young wife with her husband Daniel, who had been a schoolteacher and a kind man, and who had died of a fever in 1889, leaving her the house he had built with his own hands, and the 30 years of shared life that had happened inside it. After Daniel died, she had gone on teaching in the Greystone School for another decade, and when her eyesight began to give her trouble with the smaller texts, she had retired and spent her days in her garden, and her evenings reading by lamplight, and her mornings doing whatever needed doing in the way of women who have never required anyone else to tell them what needs doing. She was not difficult. She was not eccentric. She was a woman who had lived in a house for 30 years and had no intention of leaving it. Aldrich Pence had delivered the council's decision himself because he believed in doing difficult things directly, and because he had convinced himself that the directness was a form of respect. He had stood on her porch on the 1st of August 1902 and explained in the careful language of civic necessity that the council had voted that a generous arrangement had been made, that a room at the Drummond boarding house had been secured, that the future of Greystone required this particular piece of ground. She had listened to all of it. She had not interrupted. She had not argued. She had looked past him at the street below, and at the low hills beyond the street, and at the sky above the hills. And when he finished speaking, she said very quietly that her husband had built this house, that her roots were here. He had said what needed to be said about roots and the past and the direction of progress. He had said it with the practiced confidence of a man who has made a decision and is explaining it rather than defending it. And she had looked at him for a moment, just a moment, with those gray-blue eyes. And then she had turned and walked back into her house and closed the door. He stood on her porch for a moment after the door closed. He was not accustomed to conversations that ended this way. He was accustomed to resolution, to the firm handshake or the signed paper, or the visible capitulation that confirmed the matter was settled. The closed door gave him nothing to confirm. He walked back down Cedar Street, feeling the first small thread of something he chose not to examine too closely. The next morning she was gone. Not gone in the way of someone who has given in. Gone in the way of someone who has decided. Her few belongings were bundled on a small wooden handcart. She pushed herself, her back straight, her pace unhurried. She did not look back at the house as she left it. She walked south through town, with the particular quality of a person who knows exactly where they are going and sees no reason to explain it to anyone watching. The people who saw her from their windows watched her cross the edge of town and continue onto the open ground that led toward the scorch. There were several seconds of collective silence, and then the conversations began. The scorch was what everyone in Greystone called the hill to the south of town, and the name had the quality of a judgment that no one had ever thought to revisit. It was not scenic. It was not productive. It was a low, rough-sided hill with a southern face of cracked clay soil and a northern face that stayed in shadow half the year. Nothing worth mentioning grew on it. No one had ever built on it. The county assessor had looked at it twice in 30 years, and twice concluded that it had no assessed value worth the ink required to record it. Wren Callum pushed her handcart up its southern slope on the morning of August the 2nd, 1902, and she did not come back down. For 3 days after she arrived on the hill, she did not build anything. She sat. She walked the perimeter of the slope in the early morning when the light was low and angular, watching the way the sun moved across the face of the hill from east to west. She knelt and put her hands in the soil, pressing and rolling and reading what was there, the way a person reads a page they have been waiting to read for a long time. She sat with her back against the slope in the afternoon and felt the warmth that the south-facing earth had been collecting since dawn, radiating back against her through the fabric of her dress. She was not resting. She was learning the hill the way her grandfather, Silas Callum, had taught her to learn any place you intended to work with. Silas had been a practical man who had spent his youth in the territory of New Mexico, living and working in proximity to the Pueblo communities there. And he had absorbed from those years a set of understandings about the relationship between shelter and landscape that had never left him. He had brought those understandings back to Colorado when he came north, and he had shared them with his granddaughter in the way that people share the things they know. Matter not as lessons, but as demonstrations, not with words primarily, but with hands. He had shown her once when she was 11 years old how to feel for thermal mass in a south-facing wall. He had pressed her small hand against a stone that had been sitting in the sun all afternoon and held it there and asked her what she felt. She had said, warmth. He had said yes and held her hand there longer and asked her what else. And she had said after a moment that the warmth was coming from inside the stone, not from the sun above it. And he had said exactly right, and pressed his own palm flat against the stone, and looked at her with an expression that said this was the whole lesson, and she had gotten it. The warmth was not on the surface. It was stored inside. And it came back out slowly, steadily, long after the sun had moved on. She was 11 years old. She had understood it the way you understand things at 11 as something true and interesting and belonging to the realm of things adults knew. She had not expected to need it for herself, standing on the southern face of the scorch at 67, feeling the clay beneath her fingers and the warmth of the August sun on her back. She understood that she had been needing it all along. She had just not had the occasion to apply it. The slope faced south-southwest. It was not perfectly ideal, but it was close enough. The clay beneath the sandy topsoil was dense and plastic, the kind that farmers swore at because it stuck to everything and drained badly. To Wren, it was structural material. The hill itself would form 3 of her walls. The south-facing opening would be the 4th, the one that looked at the sun. The depth of the earth above and around her living space would be her insulation. The mass of the stone and clay in her walls would be her heating system, absorbing the day's warmth and returning it through the night, She was not going to fight the winter. She was going to become part of the landscape that winter moved through, and she was going to make herself the part that the winter could not reach. The first cut of her shovel into the hillside was on the morning of August the 5th. The sound it made was a lonely scrape, clean and definite, the only human sound for some distance in any direction. Below her, Greystone went about its business. She could see the town from where she stood, its neat grid of streets, and its proud wooden buildings and its chimneys standing straight against the sky. It looked orderly. It looked certain. It looked like a place that knew exactly what it was doing. She put her foot on the blade of the shovel and pushed and lifted and turned and deposited the first load of earth to her right, beginning the berm that would eventually shelter the structure from the north wind. Then she did it again. The work was slow. It was the slowest kind of work. There is the kind where hours of effort produce changes that a casual observer would not notice. An hour of digging might deepen the excavation by 4 or 5 inches. The clay was heavy. Each shovelful had to be lifted and carried and set down in exactly the right place to build the berm she needed. And her body was the body of a 67-year-old woman who had not done this kind of labor in some years. Her lower back sent its opinion of the proceedings loudly and persistently. She did not rush. Her grandfather had told her that the enemy of good work was impatience, and she had lived long enough to understand what he meant by that. She worked until her energy was spent, and then she stopped and drank water from the clay jug she had brought up the hill and sat and looked at what she had done. Then she started again. The people of Greystone saw her from below. There was no avoiding it. The scorch was visible from most of the town, a low rise to the south, that had always functioned as a kind of geographic boundary marker. Now there was a small figure on its southern face, moving with a slowness that was almost meditative, and the earth around her was changing very gradually into something that had a shape and a purpose that no one in town could identify with confidence. This became a source of conversation. The initial consensus was pity, which was the easiest emotion to feel about an old woman who had refused a perfectly reasonable accommodation and was apparently digging into a hillside in August. Pity was comfortable. It allowed the people of Greystone to feel generous about a situation they had collectively participated in creating, and it required nothing from them in terms of action or reconsideration. After pity came curiosity, because the digging continued and began to reveal itself as something more intentional than the town had initially assumed. The excavation had a specific rectangular shape. The earth being removed was being placed in specific locations, not randomly piled, but carefully positioned to form a wall on the north and east sides of the opening. This was not the random activity of someone who had lost their bearings. This was design. After curiosity came mockery, which was the form that discomfort takes in communities that do not want to examine their own discomfort. She digs her own grave, one man said outside the hardware store, and the sentiment spread through town with the satisfying speed of a phrase that captures what people were already thinking. It became the accepted formulation. She was digging her own grave. Winter would settle the matter. The cold would be the final argument, and it would be decisive in a way that no council vote could ever be. Harriet Drummond heard this formulation many times. She lived in the boarding house she had inherited from her mother, a solid 2-story structure on the north end of Main Street, and she occupied a position in Greystone's social geography that required her to hear most of the town's conversations, whether she wished to or not. She was 48 years old, a competent and self-contained woman who had run the boarding house since her mother's health failed 5 years ago, and she had known Wren Callum for most of that time, in the adjacent way that people in small towns know each other, which is to say she knew her routines and her reputation and her history without knowing her particularly well. She watched Wren on the hillside most mornings from the upper window of the boarding house's front room, the one that faced south. She watched the small figure moving with that deliberate economy across the face of the scorch. She noticed when the excavation deepened. She noticed when the stones began to appear carried up the hill 1 and 2 at a time by a 67-year-old woman who had apparently decided that the laws of reasonable human limitation did not apply to the current project. She noticed when the walls began to rise, laid in the rough, course-by-course manner of someone who is working by feel and memory, rather than by plans and measurements. She did not go up the hill. She did not send any message. She watched in the mornings and then went back to the work of running a boarding house and did not speak of what she saw, which was not the same as not thinking about it. The stones were the part that took the longest. Wren needed flat stones, manageable ones, the kind that could be carried by a single person and stacked without the assistance of machinery or additional hands. She found them in the gullies and the dry creek beds on the far side of the hill, where past floods had worn sandstone and limestone into rough slabs that lay half buried in the sandy soil. Getting them to her building site was the kind of problem that had only one solution, which was effort repeated until the problem was solved. She rolled the larger stones end over end. She carried the smaller ones 2 at a time, cradled against her chest. She dragged what she could not carry. She rested when she needed to rest and started again when she could. The dust of the Colorado summer settled on her clothes and her hair and the creases of her hands. She drank a great deal of water. She lost weight she did not have to spare. She thought about her grandfather while she worked. She thought about the particular quality of his attention when he was doing something with his hands, the way he would go quiet, and his movements would become absolutely economical, not slow exactly, but deliberate in a way that made slowness irrelevant. He had told her once that the only way to do difficult physical work was to stop fighting the fact that it was difficult. You accepted the weight. You accepted the distance. You accepted the time it was going to take. And then you did it. She accepted the weight of each stone. She accepted the distance between the gully and the building site. She accepted the time. The walls rose in the way that walls rise when one person is building them, which is to say, very slowly and without drama. One stone finding its place on top of the last, and the clay packed into the gaps with patient hands. The north and east and west walls were the hill itself, the excavation providing a natural enclosure on 3 sides. The south wall was what she built, and it was not a wall in the conventional sense, but an opening, a frame to hold the translucent panels of scraped hide she had prepared years ago and kept rolled and stored against some future use she had not yet defined. The opening faced south-southwest exactly as she had planned. It would receive the low winter sun for most of the day and direct it into the interior, where the stone walls would absorb it. Aldrich Pence came up the hill in October, when the structure had reached roughly its finished height, and the chimney was beginning to take shape. He came in the afternoon on a day when the sky was clear and cold and the distant mountains had their first permanent snow on the highest peaks. He came alone, and he came, he told himself, as a matter of official concern rather than personal interest. Though the distinction was thinner than he pretended, he stood at the base of the south-facing slope and looked at what she had made. It was not what he had expected, though he would have had difficulty saying precisely what he had expected. He had been thinking in the direction of a crude shack, something hastily assembled and obviously inadequate, something that would confirm what he had been saying since August. What he saw instead was a structure that appeared to have been built by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had taken considerable time doing it correctly. It was not large. It was not beautiful. But it had the specific quality of something that belonged exactly where it was, that had grown from the hillside, rather than being placed on top of it. He called up to her. She was working on the chimney, her back to him, setting stones with the focused patience she brought to everything. He said what he had come to say. He said it in the tone he used for official pronouncements, calm and assured, and leaving no room for the possibility that the pronouncement might be mistaken. The first snows would be here in a month. That structure would be her tomb. The boarding house room remained available if she came to her senses. She paused in her work. She turned and looked down at him from where she stood beside the unfinished chimney, silhouetted against the afternoon sky. She looked at him for a moment with those gray-blue eyes, the eyes that had watched him from her doorway in August, with an expression he had been carrying around in the back of his mind ever since, without quite knowing what to do with it. She did not speak. She gave a single slow nod, the kind that acknowledges a statement without agreeing with it, and then she turned back to the chimney and set the next stone. He stood there for a moment longer than was dignified. Then he walked back down the hill. He told himself on the way down that he had done what needed to be done. He had delivered the official position clearly, and she had heard it. What she chose to do with it was her own affair and her own responsibility. He had fulfilled his obligation. He did not think about the nod. He tried not to think about the nod. What he could not quite stop thinking about was the way the structure had looked on the hillside, the way it sat into the slope rather than against it, the way the stone walls nearly 2 feet thick had a density and permanence that was entirely different from the frame-built wooden structures of Greystone, whose walls were essentially elaborate arguments against the wind rather than genuine barriers to it. He had pressed his hand against one of those stone walls when he first climbed the slope, before Wren turned around and saw him there. The stone had been warm from the afternoon sun in a way that went deeper than the surface. He had pulled his hand away and not thought about it again, or tried not to. Back in town, the construction of his civic center proceeded. The framing was up. The walls were being closed in. The memorial garden had been designed, and the materials for Eleanor's bench had been ordered. He threw himself into the details of it with the focused energy of a man who does not want his attention to wander toward things he has already decided. The first snow came in November, gentle and preliminary, testing the temperature of the season. In the days before it arrived, Wren finished the chimney and sealed the hide panels into the south-facing frame, and laid the final layer of clay over the earthen roof. From below, the structure was barely visible as a structure. It was more like a thickening of the hillside, a slight irregularity in the slope that you might not notice if you did not know to look for it. From her chimney, a thread of smoke began to rise. Not a great column of smoke, not the aggressive output of an iron stove being fed against the cold. A thin, pale thread, the kind of smoke that comes from a small fire, burning efficiently in a well-designed hearth. It rose straight up in still air and bent gently with the breeze and disappeared into the sky with the quiet confidence of something that knew it had done its job. From town, several people noticed it. Several people pointed it out to several other people. The general assessment was that she had lit a fire and was keeping herself marginally alive with whatever fuel she had managed to gather, and that this was a temporary condition that the serious cold would soon resolve. Inside the structure on the hillside, in the space that the town below was calling a tomb, the south-facing panels admitted the low November sun for most of the day. The light fell on the stone floor and the stone walls, and began the slow process of charging the thermal mass that Wren had been building all summer and fall. The walls stored the heat the way stone stores heat, not as a quick flush of warmth, but as a deep, patient accumulation that would pay out through the long, cold nights. The varden she had planted along the south-facing wall showed its first green shoots, kale and chard and the hardy root vegetables that could survive the cool temperature of the interior. The herbs she had brought from her garden on Cedar Street filled the small space with a clean, sharp smell that had nothing to do with winter. She was warm. She was fed. She was at peace with what she had built in a way that she had not been at peace with much of anything since Daniel died 13 years ago. From her doorway, looking down at the town below, she could see the plumes of smoke rising from every chimney in Greystone, thick and constant and urgent. She knew what those plumes meant. Each one represented a fire that needed constant fuel. An iron stove burning wood and coal at a rate that had seemed adequate in September and was already beginning to feel less certain in November. The winter ahead was going to be a serious one. She could read it in the way the cold came in from the mountains, in the particular quality of the clear nights and the direction of the wind. She had been reading weather for 67 years. She looked at those smoke plumes and she did not feel triumph. She felt something closer to sorrow. The specific sorrow of someone who has information that other people need and has not found a way to share it, that they are willing to receive. She had tried in her way. She had spent 30 years in a classroom. She knew something about what it meant to have knowledge that others needed. And she knew equally well that knowledge offered too directly or too early is often refused by people who have not yet understood why they need it. The town had called her a fool. The mayor had delivered her doom as a matter of civic record. There was nothing left to say. So she built. She built correctly and carefully, the way her grandfather had shown her, working with the earth and the sun and the weight of stone rather than against them. She built the kind of structure that did not fight winter but existed inside it, making itself a small, warm exception to the general rule of the cold, invisible, and unremarkable from the outside and entirely functional within. The first real snow of December came on a Tuesday afternoon, and Greystone settled into its winter routines with the practiced confidence of a town that had been surviving Colorado winters for 30 years and knew exactly what that required. The wood piles were tall. The coal had been delivered and stacked. The iron stoves in every house were stoked and burning their chimneys, sending their thick columns of smoke into the sky, the visible evidence of warmth that was being consumed as fast as it was produced. On the scorch, a thread of pale smoke rose from a chimney that no one could quite see from a structure that was becoming in the collective imagination of Greystone less of a real place and more of a cautionary symbol. The folly on the hill. The grave the old woman had dug herself. Wren Callum tended her fire and her garden and her stores. She checked her snares in the early mornings before the cold settled in fully. She dried rabbit meat and root vegetables and stored them in the cool dark of the hillside above her living space. She recorded the temperature inside and outside every morning and evening in a small notebook she kept by the hearth, watching the differential between the two numbers grow as the season deepened. Inside, she was warm. Outside, January was coming. And January in the Colorado mountains in the winter of 1903 was going to be something that the town of Greystone had built itself to endure. It had not built itself quite enough. December moved through Greystone with the particular confidence of a season that knows it has months ahead of it and is not in any hurry. The cold came in from the mountains in waves, each one a degree or two deeper. Then the last, testing the town's preparations the way a man tests ice before he commits his full weight to it. The wood piles shrank. The coal supplies held. The iron stoves burned through the nights with the steady consumption of something that needs constant feeding. And the people of Greystone fed them and told themselves that this was simply winter, that they had done this before and would do it again, that the preparations had been adequate. Most of them believed this. It is easier to believe in your preparations than to question them, particularly when you have invested months of effort and considerable money in making them. The alternative is a kind of doubt that has nowhere comfortable to land. Wren Callum had no such doubt to manage. She had built what she intended to build, and it was doing what she had intended it to do, and the evidence was available to her every morning when she pressed her hand against the interior stone wall and felt the warmth that had accumulated there through the previous day, returning itself to the air of the room. She did not need to believe in her preparations. She could feel them. Her routine had settled into the particular rhythm of someone who has organized their life around the actual requirements of their situation, rather than around habit or expectation. She rose before the light was full and checked her snares on the lower slope of the hill, where the small game ran in the pre-dawn quiet. She tended the fire with the minimum fuel required to maintain the temperature she needed, never burning more than the hearth required, always watching the stones of the firebox to understand what the clay body of the stove was doing. She tended the garden along the south-facing wall, the kale and chard, and the hardy roots that grew in the cool stability of the interior, untroubled by the frost that gripped everything outside. She recorded her temperatures morning and evening in the small notebook by the hearth. Inside 48 degrees at the coldest before the winter sun came through the panels, and the clay began to release what it had stored. Outside, dropping steadily as December wore on, 12 degrees one morning, 7 the following week, 4 below zero on the last day of the month, 48 inside, 4 below outside. She wrote the numbers in her careful hand and looked at them and thought about the iron stoves in the houses below, each one requiring a fire that burned all night to keep the interior temperature from dropping below freezing. She thought about the fuel those fires consumed and about the wood piles that had looked so large in September. She thought about January. The town below continued its own form of record-keeping, which was the informal accounting of public opinion. The story of Wren on the Scorch had not resolved itself into a settled narrative, which made people uncomfortable in the way that unresolved stories always do. She had not died in November as predicted. She had not come down from the hill and asked for the boarding house room. She had not done anything that allowed the town to close the chapter and move on to other subjects. She was still up there, visible in the early mornings when her chimney thread caught the light, still apparently alive and apparently functional in ways that no one could quite account for. There were people who walked to the edge of town and looked up at the scorch and tried to make sense of what they saw. The structure itself was nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. It had become part of the hillside in a way that wooden buildings never become part of anything sitting into the slope with the settled permanence of something geological. The chimney alone gave it away, a stone column barely taller than a standing person, unremarkable except for its location and the thin smoke that rose from it at certain hours. A man named Carver, who had a reputation for the kind of practical intelligence that had nothing to do with formal education, walked up the hill one afternoon in late December on his own initiative and stood outside the structure for several minutes before coming back to town. He told 3 people that the walls were nearly 2 feet thick and that the stone they were built from had a warmth to it that he could not explain given the temperature of the air. He was not a man inclined toward exaggeration. The 3 people he told others. The information moved through town in the way information moves when it contradicts something people have already decided, which is to say it moved quietly and created a kind of low, persistent discomfort rather than any clear reassessment. Mayor Aldrich Pence heard Carver's report secondhand and dismissed it with the facility of a man who has built his position on being right and cannot afford the implications of being wrong. The walls were thick because she had nothing else to do with the stone she gathered. The warmth Carver felt was the December sun on south-facing stone, nothing more. These were the explanations of a man reasoning backward from a conclusion rather than forward from evidence, and some part of him knew it, which was why the dismissal required more effort than it should have. He was busy with the Civic Center. The framing was complete and the interior walls were being finished, and there were 100 decisions that required his attention. and he focused on those decisions with the concentrated energy of someone who is using work to prevent himself from thinking about something else. He visited Eleanor's memorial garden design 3 times in a single week and made no changes, which was not the behavior of a man managing a project, but of a man returning to a place where he expected to find something and keeps finding nothing. December ended. January came in quietly, which was the first thing that was wrong about it. And Greystone's experienced serious winter arrived with some kind of announcement. A dramatic temperature drop or a sustained period of wind that told you what was coming. The first week of January 1903 was still and cold and clear, the sky an improbable deep blue. Above the white landscape, the mountains sharp and close-looking, the way they get when the air is thin and dry. It was beautiful, in the way of things that are preparing to do something serious. Wren noticed the quality of the air on the morning of January the 14th. It had changed overnight. Not the temperature, which was the same brutal cold it had been for a week, but something in the pressure and the smell of it. Something that registered in the part of the human nervous system that remembers being animals who could not afford to ignore these signals. She had felt this quality of air before, not often, but enough times to know what it preceded. She spent the morning doing things she had already done. She checked her fuel supply and found it adequate. She checked her food stores and found them more than adequate. The dried meat and roots in the living garden along the south wall. The clean clay jugs of water she had filled on the last reasonably warm day. She checked the structural integrity of the earthen roof, pressing her hands against the clay from inside to feel for any places where the freeze-thaw cycle might have introduced instability. She found none. She went outside and cleared the small drainage channel she had built at the base of the south-facing wall, the one designed to move water away from the foundation during snowmelt. She did these things not because they needed doing, but because Silas Callum had taught her that preparation continued until the event arrived, and not one moment before. You did not stop preparing because you felt prepared. You stopped when the thing you had been preparing for made further preparation impossible. She was inside sitting by the hearth with a bowl of root stew when the sky to the west changed color. She went to the south-facing panel and looked out. The mountains, which had been sharp and visible all week, were gone. In their place was a wall. Not a cloud formation. A wall. A vertical mass of white and gray that rose from the ground to the top of the visible sky, solid and absolute, and it was moving eastward with a speed that was wrong, that belonged to something with more intention than weather generally announces. She watched it for perhaps 10 seconds. Then she turned and put her bowl on the hearthstone and added the last piece of fuel she would need for a while. The clay body of the stove was at full temperature. The thermal mass of the walls was charged from a week of cold but clear days during which the south-facing panels had done their work. The food stores were inside. The water was inside. The door was sealed. She sat down in her chair by the hearth, and the blizzard arrived. It did not arrive gradually. It did not build politely from a stiff wind to something more serious. It arrived complete and without warning, the full force of it, the way a door slams rather than closes. The wind hit the earthen roof and the berm on the north side of the structure and the thick stone walls, and found very little to work with. She could hear it above her, a sustained roar that had the quality of something enormous passing over, rather than something attacking. The hide panels in the south-facing frame shuddered once and held. Inside, the air was still. Inside, the temperature was 47 degrees. She poured herself another bowl of stew from the pot that had been simmering since morning and ate it slowly, listening to the sound of the blizzard doing its work on the world above and around her. It was not the sound of danger. It was the sound of weather passing over a structure that had been built to let it pass. She thought about the town below. She thought about the wooden houses with their frame construction, and their thin walls and their iron stoves. She thought about the way those stoves required constant fuel to maintain interior temperature, and about the fuel supplies that had been calculated for an ordinary winter, rather than this one. She thought about the roofs built to shed water and ordinary snow loads, but not engineered for what the weight of a significant blizzard could impose. She thought about the families inside those houses burning through their wood and coal, at the rate that iron stoves demand watching their supplies, with the first real uncertainty of the season. She was not thinking these things with satisfaction. She was thinking them with a kind of quiet grief, the grief of someone who saw clearly what was happening and had not found a way to prevent it. Outside, the blizzard intensified. In Greystone, the first roof gave way at 2 a.m. Thomas Pence was awake when it happened, because he had been lying awake for an hour, listening to the sound the wind was making on their house, which was not the sound he was accustomed to hearing during winter storms. It was more sustained and more violent, and it had a quality of building rather than ebbing, as if the storm were still arriving rather than passing through. He had been telling himself that this was normal, that the house had survived 30 Colorado winters, that his father had ensured the preparations were adequate. Then he heard the first crack. It was not a small sound. It was the sound of structural timber failing under a load. It was not designed to carry a deep resonant fracture that he felt in his chest before he understood what it was. Then the ceiling of the parlor came down. He was not in the parlor. He was in his room at the back of the house, and the wall between his room and the parlor held. He stayed against that wall and listened to the sound of the collapse, the secondary failures following the first, the crash and settling that goes on for several seconds after the initial event. Then silence except for the wind pouring through the open structure where the roof had been. His father was in the parlor. Mayor Aldrich Pence had been unable to sleep and had gone downstairs for a glass of water, as he often did in the sleepless hours, as he had done many nights since Eleanor died, because the bed they had shared for 26 years was sometimes easier to leave than to lie in. He had been standing by the kitchen window looking out at the white nothing of the blizzard when the parlor roof came in. Thomas called his father's name and heard nothing back. He moved through the dark house with his hands on the walls, feeling his way toward the parlor door, and opened it into a wall of cold air and the smell of plaster and broken wood. He called again. Something moved in the debris, a sound. Not a word, but a sound that meant there was still someone there to make it. He could not move the largest beams. He was 22 years old and reasonably strong, and he could not move the largest beams, because the largest beams were not designed to be moved by one person without equipment. He got his father's arm free, and then his head and shoulders, and understood from what he could feel in the dark that there was serious injury there. He could not get him out. He had no fire. The iron stove in the kitchen was still burning, but the kitchen shared a wall with the collapsed parlor, and the wall was no longer entirely there, and the cold that was pouring in from the open structure was winning against the stove faster than he could calculate. Within 2 hours, maybe less, the temperature inside what remained of the house would be the same as the temperature outside. He did everything he could think of doing. He covered his father with the blankets from his own bed and tucked them around the debris holding him in place. He put on every layer of clothing he owned. He opened the kitchen door and felt the full force of what was outside. 60 miles an hour of wind driving snow that was not snow anymore but a physical substance. A horizontal scour that took the breath and replaced it with cold before the lungs could process the exchange. He could not see 6 feet. He went back inside and stood in the ruined kitchen by the failing stove and looked at the ceiling, which was still intact here, but was groaning under the load. It was being asked to carry by the failure of the structure beside it. He thought about the smoke. He had seen it from his bedroom window in the early mornings for months. A thin, pale thread rising from somewhere on the scorch, barely visible. Something you only noticed if you were specifically looking in that direction. He had mentioned it to his father once in September, and his father had said it was the old woman keeping herself alive by some means or another, and the conversation had moved on. He had seen it every clear morning since, without particular thought. He thought about it now with very particular thought. He got the rope from the mudroom and tied one end to the kitchen door handle and the other end around his waist, and went outside. He had nothing to navigate by. The world had been replaced by a single white substance that was indistinguishable from the air, except that it was moving horizontally at 60 miles an hour, and contained crystals of ice that found every gap in his clothing immediately. He could not see the ground. He could not see the buildings he knew were beside him. He walked with one hand extended in front of him, and his body turned against the wind, and his eyes reduced to slits against the ice, following the upward slope of the land the way a blind man follows a wall. The rope ran out before he found the hill. He stood in the dark and the roaring white with the rope taut against his waist, and understood that going back to get more rope would take time. He might not have, and that his father was under debris in a collapsing house. He untied the rope from his waist and held the end of it and kept walking uphill because the hill was the only direction he had. He fell 4 times. The drifts were thigh-deep in places and chest-deep in the spaces between houses where the wind had pushed the snow into walls. He crawled through the worst of them on his hands and knees, keeping the upward angle of the slope as his only reference. His face had stopped hurting approximately when he passed the edge of town, which was not a reassuring development. He was moving on something less than rational decision-making. He was moving on the last available instinct, the one that looks for fire. He saw the smoke before he saw anything else. Not the smoke itself, which was invisible in the dark and the storm. He saw the place where the sky was slightly less dark than the rest of the sky. A fractional warming of the darkness above one specific point on the hillside that had no explanation except heat rising from below. He moved toward it with everything he had left. His hand found stone. Not loose stone, but laid stone, a wall rising from the slope at an angle that was slightly wrong for natural rock formation. Slightly too deliberate, the work of hands rather than geology. He followed the wall to where there was not wall anymore, and there was a door. He could not lift his hand to knock. He used his shoulder against the wood. The door opened. The warmth that came out was not the aggressive heat of an iron stove running at full capacity. It was something gentler and more fundamental, the warmth of a space that had been maintaining a steady temperature for a long time. The warmth of mass and insulation. Rather than fire, the warmth of a room that was simply warmer than the world outside it. In the same uncomplicated way that caves are warmer than the air above them. He fell through the door. He was aware of hands on his arms, and the sound of the door shutting behind him, and the roar of the wind cutting off so completely and so suddenly that the silence rang like something physical. He was aware of a floor under him that was warmer than floors had any right to be in January in Colorado. He was aware of a lamp. He was aware of a bowl placed near his face. He was aware of Wren Callum kneeling beside him, not speaking, her expression carrying nothing that he could read as triumph or resentment, or the satisfaction of a person whose predictions have been confirmed. She looked at him with the focused attention of someone who is assessing a problem and determining what needs to be done about it. She was 67 years old, and she had just dragged a 22-year-old man who outweighed her by a considerable margin across her threshold. And she was doing it without apparent difficulty because she had decided it needed doing. She stripped the outer layers of his clothing. She wrapped him in the wool blanket from her own chair. She put the bowl of broth in his hands and closed his fingers around it and held them there until she was satisfied he had the grip. He tried to speak. He managed a few words about his father, about the roof, about the house. She listened to all of it with the same focused attention. Then she did something that took him several minutes to understand. She did not tell him she could not help. She did not tell him the storm was too severe. She did not offer condolences or explanations or the varieties of helplessness that he had been expecting from the moment he fell through her door. She got her coat. He watched her put on her coat and her heavy wool wrappings, and her boots with the leather laces she double-knotted with practiced efficiency. He watched her take the lantern from the hook by the door and check the oil. He watched her take the coil of rope from the shelf beside the door. Thicker rope than his had been longer already knotted at intervals. He said she could not go out in this. He said it with the absolute conviction of someone who had just come through that storm and knew what it was. She looked at him. She said that he needed to stay here and stay warm, and that she would need him functional when she got back. Then she tied one end of the rope to the iron ring sunk into the stone of the doorframe. A ring he had not noticed until she used it. A ring she had placed there in November as a matter of preparation. She tied the other end around her waist. She looked at the lantern to confirm the flame was steady. She opened the door. The storm took the door from her hand immediately, and she caught it and pulled it back against the wind and got through it and got it shut behind her and was gone. Thomas sat on the warm floor with his back against the stone wall and his hands around the bowl of broth and listened to the sound of the blizzard, which was the same sound it had been before, but felt entirely different now, because a 67-year-old woman had walked into it with a rope and a lantern to find his father. He did not know what the stone walls were doing. He did not know about thermal mass, or the principle of passive solar heating, or the relationship between surface area and heat retention. What he knew was that the floor beneath him was warm in a way he could feel through the blanket and through the wool of his trousers, and that the air in the room was a temperature that his body understood as survivable, and that this was the case without any fire that he could see burning at anything more than a modest rate in the small hearth across the room. He looked at the garden along the south wall. The kale was green. In January, in the worst storm he had ever experienced. There was green growing in this room while the world outside was white and lethal. And the sight of it did something to his thinking that he would spend years afterward trying to accurately describe. It was not simply that a plant was growing. It was that the evidence before him required a fundamental revision of what he had understood to be possible. He had heard his father call it a tomb. He sat on the warm floor and looked at the green garden and waited. She came back in 45 minutes. Which was 45 minutes of the storm doing everything the storm had been doing to him on his journey up the hill, and she came back with his father. She did not come back alone. She came back with Aldrich Pence supported between her and the rope, his arm over her shoulder, moving on his own feet, because she had found a way to get him free of the debris, moving with the particular careful attention of someone who has been seriously hurt and is choosing to keep moving anyway. She got the door open. She got him inside. She got the door shut. She seated Aldrich Pence on the floor beside his son and stripped his outer layers with the same efficient, unsentimental care she had given Thomas. She examined him in the lamplight, his arm and his shoulder, his head, where something had grazed it. She made her assessment without speaking. Then she got the second bowl from the shelf and filled it from the pot on the hearth and set it in front of him. Thomas looked at his father. His father looked at the room. He looked at the stone walls and the earthen ceiling and the south-facing panels and the garden. He looked at the hearth where a small, steady fire burned with nothing like the desperate consumption of the iron stoves he knew. He looked at the warm floor and placed one hand flat against it and held it there. He looked at Wren Callum, who had gone back to her chair by the hearth and was pulling off her outer wrappings with the movements of someone who has done something difficult and is ready to be done with it. He said nothing. He picked up the bowl with his uninjured arm and held it in both hands and stared at the fire. They were the second and third. They were not the last. The storm ran through the night and into the following day and into the night after that. By the morning of the second day, the situation in Greystone had moved from difficult to catastrophic in the quiet, incremental way that disasters develop when each individual problem seems manageable until the accumulation of them is not. A second roof had come in. Fuel supplies in the smaller houses were running critically short, the consumption of the storm having overwhelmed calculations made during a milder October. The cold inside houses where the stoves had gone cold or been reduced to embers was approaching the kind of cold that does physiological damage within hours. People began to move, not because they had a plan, but because staying still had become untenable, and because human beings in extremity look for the same things they have always looked for, which is warmth and shelter, and the company of other people. Several of them saw the smoke. It was barely visible in the storm, the thinnest possible thread of pale rising from a source that required knowing where to look. But several people who had lived in Greystone for years and had spent months watching that thread appear in the morning sky had the information stored in their memory, and in the extremity of the blizzard, that information became available to them in a way that idle observation had not made it. They knew where to look. They looked. They moved toward it. They came one and two at a time through the rest of the second day, following whatever path through the drifts, and the wind brought them to the south face of the scorch. A woman named Della with two young children, one carried and one pulled by the hand, her face carrying the expression of someone who has gone past fear into the focused clarity that comes after it. A man named Orrin, whose house had lost power to keep its stove burning by midnight, who had spent 6 hours feeding the stove everything available before arriving at the door of a woman he had referred to in public as a well-meaning fool. An elderly couple named the Bracebridges, who had lived in Greystone longer than anyone and who arrived holding hands. The way people hold hands when they are not sure they will arrive but have decided to arrive together, or not at all. Harriet Drummond came on the evening of the second day leading a family of 4 from the boarding house whose room had become untenable when a window gave way. She was the one who moved most deliberately with the contained expression of a woman who has been thinking about something for a long time and has finally run out of room to avoid acting on it. She had known where the structure was. She had been watching it for months from the upper window of the boarding house. She had the information. She had simply not acted on it until acting on it was the only available option. She came through the door and stood for a moment in the warmth and looked around the room. She looked at the people on the floor. She looked at the garden. She looked at Wren, who was moving between the survivors with broth and blankets, and the focused, quiet efficiency that she brought to everything. Harriet Drummond looked at Wren Callum and opened her mouth and found that the thing she wanted to say required more honesty than she was accustomed to offering in ordinary circumstances, and she found that the circumstances were no longer ordinary. And so she said it. She said that she had watched from her window since September. She said that she had understood in some imprecise way that what she was watching was not folly. She said that she had said nothing and done nothing, and that the space between what she knew and what she did had its own consequences that she would need to think about when there was time. Wren looked at her for a moment. Then she stepped aside from the doorway. Harriet Drummond brought her people inside. She took off her outer wrappings and asked what needed doing and began doing it. The room held 14 people by the end of the second night. It was not a large room, a single room deliberately modest in its dimensions, because smaller spaces are more efficiently heated, and because Wren had built exactly what she needed, and nothing more. 14 people in that space was crowded in the way that survival is often crowded, with no one worrying about the crowding, because the alternative had become too clear. The temperature inside held at 46 degrees. Outside, according to the last reliable report that had come out of Greystone before communications failed, it was 31 below zero. 46 degrees inside. 31 below outside. The fire in the small hearth burned steadily and modestly, the clay walls and floor absorbing and releasing their stored heat with the indifferent reliability of dense material, doing what dense material does. The garden along the south wall provided greens for the broth that had been simmering since before the storm arrived. The roof did not move. The walls did not move. The cold pressed against them and found no purchase the way it finds no purchase against the earth itself, which has a mass that weather cannot relocate. Outside, the blizzard was not finished. Inside, 14 people breathed warm air and waited for it to be. The blizzard ended the way serious things end, not with a dramatic conclusion, but with a gradual lessening, a reduction in the wind's sustained fury that happened so incrementally that the people inside the earthen structure on the scorch were not certain it was ending until several hours after it had. The roar that had been the constant backdrop of 3 days diminished to a howl, and the howl diminished to a moan, and the moan diminished to the ordinary sound of winter wind moving across open ground, which is a sound people in Colorado know and can tolerate because it does not have the intention the blizzard's wind had. Wren was the first one outside. She went before full light, while the others were still sleeping or lying in the quiet watchfulness of people who have been through something and are not yet certain it is over. She pulled on her outer layers with the practiced efficiency of someone who has been dressing for serious cold all winter, and opened the door onto a world that had been remade in the night. The drifts were extraordinary. The south-facing slope of the scorch, which had been cleared ground in January, was buried under snow that in places reached to the eaves of the structure. She had built the earthen roof barely visible above the white surface. She stood in the doorway for a moment and assessed. The drainage channel was buried, but the structure itself was intact. The weight of the snow on the earthen roof was within what she had calculated for, and the clay had held it the way she had known it would, with the impassive durability of something that has been in place long enough to know that weather is temporary. She looked down toward the town. The scale of what had happened was visible from the hill in a way that it could not have been from inside it. Greystone was there, its grid of streets identifiable by the slight variations in the surface of the snow. But it was not the town she had looked at from this hillside all winter. 3 roof lines were broken, their collapsed structures visible as depressions in the snow surface where the buildings had failed under the weight. The rest of the town was buried to its second-floor windows. Nothing moved. No smoke rose from any chimney she could see. She stood there for the long time in the early gray light. Then she went back inside and began making more broth. The survivors woke to the smell of it, the clean smell of simmering root vegetables, and the dried rabbit she had added from her stores. And there was a period of confused adjustment as 14 people in a single room processed the shift from the sustained emergency of the blizzard to the different kind of emergency that came after it. The cold was still extreme. The world outside was still not navigable in any ordinary sense, but the storm itself had passed, and this distinction mattered in the way that the difference between an active threat and its aftermath always matters even when the aftermath is severe. Thomas Pence helped his father sit upright against the stone wall. Aldrich Pence had slept badly, his injured shoulder making sleep difficult, and his face in the morning light had the quality of someone who has been through an internal reckoning as well as a physical one. He was not a man who showed what he was thinking, not as a rule, but the room was small, and there was nowhere to direct the eye that did not contain evidence of something he was being asked to reconsider. He looked at the garden. He looked at it in the morning light, with the south-facing panels admitting the first pale January sun. The kale green and unhurried, growing in the steady cool of the interior, as if the blizzard had been something happening in another story. He looked at the walls, and at the floor, and at the small hearth where a modest fire had burned all night and produced a temperature that 14 people had survived in without significant additional heat source. He looked at the ceiling of packed earth and stone that had held the weight of however many feet of snow had accumulated above it during 3 days of the worst storm he had ever seen. He looked at all of this and said nothing because the man he had been in October, the man who had stood on this hillside and delivered a verdict, did not have language available for what the man he was in January needed to say. Wren moved through the room with broth and the efficient care of someone who has been assessing and attending to 14 people for 3 days and has not yet allowed herself to stop doing it. She checked the children first, the 2 that Della had brought, and found them unchanged from the previous evening, which was the best available outcome. She checked the elderly Bracebridges who had survived the night in the particular stoic manner of people who have already survived a great many nights and have developed a professional competence at it. She checked the others in the systematic way of someone working through a list. She came to Aldrich Pence last. She crouched beside him with the same focused, unsentimental attention she had given everyone else. She looked at his shoulder and at his head where the beam had grazed him, and at his color, which was better than it had been the previous evening. She handed him a bowl of broth. She waited while he took it. He looked at her over the rim of the bowl. He looked at her with the eyes of a man who has been assembling something in the night and has not finished assembling it, but has gotten far enough to see the shape of what it is. He said the only thing he could say, which was the question he could not ask. He said, "How?" One word. He said it in a voice that had none of the authority his voice usually carried, none of the smooth assurance of a man who has spent 20 years delivering judgments and expecting them to be received. He said it as a genuine question, which was something he had not asked in a long time. Because genuine questions require genuine uncertainty, and genuine uncertainty had not been comfortable for Aldrich Pence in quite some time. Wren looked at him. She said that he had been fighting the winter. She held out the bowl. She said that she had just asked it for shelter. He took the bowl with the arm that was not injured, his hand around the clay, and the expression on his face was not the expression she had seen in August when he stood on her porch and told her about progress and the future and the directions that rivers of history were flowing. It was something entirely different, something that required the absence of certainty to exist. He held the bowl in both hands, and the man who had built a career on being right let the silence say what words were not yet equal to. His son put a hand on his uninjured shoulder. Neither of them spoke. The fire burned steadily in the small hearth, and the stone walls gave back the warmth they had stored. And outside, the January sun began to move across the south-facing panels and start the day's work of charging the thermal mass for the coming night. The days that followed were the days of digging out and counting what remained. Wren organized the work from the structure on the scorch, with the practical clarity of someone who has been thinking about systems and logistics for months and is now applying that thinking to a changed situation. The first necessity was establishing which houses in Greystone were intact and which were not. And this required people to go into the town and assess and report back. Thomas and Aaron went first, the two men who were physically most capable, and came back with information that confirmed what Wren had been able to read from the hillside. 3 structures were total losses. Several more were compromised, but standing their integrity uncertain, requiring evaluation before they could be occupied. The rest of the town had survived with varying degrees of damage, the wooden buildings having done the things that wooden buildings do in extreme conditions, which includes everything from fine to catastrophic, with a distribution that depended on the specific construction, the specific site, and a degree of fortune that no amount of preparation could entirely eliminate. The civic center that Aldrich Pence had been building was one of the total losses. The framing that had been completed in December was down. The memorial garden he had planned in the center of it was buried under debris and snow in a configuration that would require considerable effort to access. The stone where Eleanor's name was to have been carved was intact somewhere under that debris because stone survives what wood does not. He was told this by Thomas on the second morning after the storm, and he received the information without the reaction that Thomas had been bracing for, the anger, or the grief, or the collapse that the loss of the thing he had been building toward seemed to warrant. He received it in silence, and then he said that they would deal with it when the more urgent things had been dealt with. And this was the response of a man whose priorities had been substantially reorganized by 3 days on the warm floor of an earthen structure on a hill that no one had wanted. Wren's structure became the center of the recovery operation in the practical way that centers establish themselves, which is by being where the resources and the organizing intelligence are. She had food when the town's supplies were inaccessible or depleted. She had warmth that cost nothing to sustain. She had the capacity to think clearly about systems and priorities that comes from having spent 5 months doing exactly that in a context where the consequences of unclear thinking were immediate and personal. People came to her for different things. Some came for food which she gave without accounting for it, because accounting for it in these circumstances would have been a kind of meanness she was not capable of. Some came for warmth, and she let them sit on the floor by the hearth for as long as they needed. Some came gradually and with varying degrees of discomfort to ask her questions. The questions began technically because technical questions were easier to ask than the other kind. How thick were the walls? What kind of clay? How did the roof hold the weight? How did the fire manage to heat the room on so little fuel? Wren answered all of these questions with the patient precision of a woman who spent 30 years teaching, and who understands that the answers people need are not always the answers they think they are asking for. She talked about thermal mass in the plain language of someone who learned it from demonstration, rather than theory. She talked about the difference between a material that gets hot quickly and cools quickly, and a material that absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. And she talked about it in terms of the stone floor they were sitting on and the warmth they could feel rising from it, because the warmth they could feel was better than any abstraction she could offer. She talked about the south-facing orientation and the low angle of winter sun. How winter sun, which everyone experienced as weak and insufficient, was actually ideal for this purpose, because its low angle meant it penetrated deeply into a south-facing space for many hours of the short winter day. She had learned this from her grandfather, Silas, who had learned it from men who had been applying it for generations before him in the high desert country of New Mexico, who had understood through accumulated practice what Wren was now explaining to the people of Greystone through accumulated evidence. She talked about the earthen roof and the logic of insulation, the way soil does not transmit temperature, change the way air does, the way a foot of packed earth maintains a stable temperature that the surface above it has almost no access to. People listened. Some of them listened with the focused attention of people who are writing things down in their minds because they understand they will need these things. Some of them listened with the slower, more difficult attention of people who are simultaneously trying to revise something they believed confidently for a long time, which is harder than learning something new, because it requires first making room. Harriet Drummond sat through most of these conversations. She had made herself useful in the practical work of the recovery in ways that were consistent with her character, which was organizational and quietly capable, and she applied that capability to the logistics of the recovery operation without being asked to and without making her contributions conspicuous. She was working through something, and she worked through it in the way she did most things, which was by doing the next necessary thing until the larger shape of what she needed to do became clear. On the fourth day after the storm, when the immediate crisis had been addressed, and the survivors had been accounted for, and the losses had been recorded, with the grief that they warranted, she found herself alone with Wren in the early morning before the others woke. She said she had watched from her window since September. She said it quietly and directly, with none of the social softening that the statement might have been given in other circumstances. She said she had understood that what she was watching was not what the town was saying it was. She said she had known the walls were different from ordinary walls because she had walked up the hill once in October in the afternoon when Wren was on the far side gathering stones and had placed her hand against the south-facing stone and felt what Wren had built into it. She said she had gone back down the hill and said nothing. Wren listened to all of this and waited. Harriet said that she understood the consequences of her silence were not abstract. She said that understanding it in retrospect was not the same as having acted on it, and she was not attempting to suggest that it was. She was attempting to account for it in the only way that accounting for something is possible, which is by saying it plainly to the person it most affected. Wren looked at her for a long moment. She said that silence had its costs, that she understood why it was chosen. That understanding why something was chosen was not the same as finding it without consequence, but that it was the beginning of the only kind of honesty that was durable. She said that Harriet was here now. She said it in a tone that meant something more than the literal geography of the situation. It meant that the relevant question was not what had been done or not done in September or October, but what was going to be done with what they both knew now in January on the other side of something that had made several things much clearer than they had been. Harriet nodded. She picked up the pot that needed water and went to fill it. She did not ask what she should do because she had already decided. The deciding was what the 4 days of practical work had been, the deliberate process of a woman who thinks through action rather than through speech, committing herself to a direction. The rebuilding conversations began before the snow had fully settled, which was the right time to have them. when the failure of what had existed was still visible and undeniable, and the temptation to simply replace it with the same thing had not yet fully reasserted itself. Aldrich Pence was part of these conversations. He was not their leader, which was a new experience for him and one that required more adjustment than he would have predicted. But he was present, and he was listening, and he was contributing in ways that reflected the reorganization that had happened in him during and after the blizzard. He had been a man of plans and projections and the confident arithmetic of the future. He was in the process of becoming something somewhat different, a man who was learning to read what was already there before deciding what to put on top of it. He came to Wren on the 6th day after the storm, with a question that he asked in the way he had asked the one question he had asked her before, which was without preamble and with the directness of someone who has decided that indirection costs more than it saves. He asked her to show them how to build. Not tell, show. The distinction mattered to him, and the fact that it mattered told her something about where he had arrived that she found worth knowing. She said yes. The work of planning the new Greystone began in the structure on the scorch, because that was where the organizing intelligence was, and because the physical evidence of what they were trying to achieve was most visible there. Wren laid out the principles in the plain language she had been using all week, and the people who had survived in her structure listened with the attention of people who had recently discovered that understanding these principles was not an academic exercise. The first principle was orientation. Every structure in the new Greystone would be assessed for its relationship to the winter sun before a single stone was laid or a wall framed. South-facing slopes were to be preferred. South-facing walls were to be maximized. The neat grid of streets that had defined the old Greystone was not sacred geometry. It was a convention of convenience that had been imposed on a landscape without consulting the landscape about its preferences. The second principle was mass. Wood was not going to disappear from the building vocabulary of Greystone, because wood had genuine virtues, and because the mountain country produced it abundantly. But wood alone was no longer adequate. The walls of the new structures would incorporate stone and clay in proportions sufficient to provide thermal mass, sufficient to store the day's heat and return it through the night, sufficient to make the structure a participant in its own heating, rather than simply a container for an external heat source. The third principle was earth. The hillsides that surrounded Greystone were not obstacles to be leveled or avoided. They were resources. A structure built into a south-facing slope had 3 walls of insulation provided by the earth itself, walls that no winter could penetrate, because the earth's temperature at depth was stable in a way that no surface structure could achieve. The scorch and the hills like it on the other sides of the valley were not useless ground. They were building sites waiting for builders who understood what they were for. These principles did not require the abandonment of everything Greystone had been. They required its revision. This was harder for some people than for others, and Wren understood this without impatience, because she had been a teacher for 30 years and had learned that the people who find revision hardest are usually the people who have invested most in what is being revised, and that their investment is not nothing. Aldrich Pence was one of these people. She watched him work through it over the course of the rebuilding conversations, watched him locate the places where what she was proposing ran directly counter to what he had believed, and built his identity around. Watched him sit with those places instead of immediately resolving them in one direction or the other. This was the work that revision actually required, the sitting with the willingness to hold contradiction without immediately collapsing it. She had not expected it from him and was finding it worthy of respect. He asked her in the second week of the rebuilding conversations about the memorial garden. He asked it carefully in the indirect way of someone approaching something that still has the capacity to cause him pain, and she received the question with the care it deserved. He explained for the first time to anyone what the Civic Center had been intended to be. He explained about Eleanor and about the bench and about the name in stone and about the particular logic of a man who has lost the thing that organized his life trying to build something external to replace that internal organization. He explained it without excusing it, which was not easy for him and which she could see was not easy. She listened to all of it without speaking. Then she said that the name in stone was still under the debris. She said that stone survived what wood did not. She said that Eleanor's name would be accessible when the debris was cleared, and that what it was placed in did not have to be what had been planned. She said she thought Eleanor's name deserved to be in something that would last. He looked at her. He said he was beginning to understand what that meant. They built the first new structure together, which was not something that had been planned, but which emerged from the practical logic of the situation. The site was a south-facing slope on the east side of the valley, sheltered from the prevailing north wind by a natural rise of ground that had always been there and had always been ignored. Wren directed the excavation and the stone laying with the hands-on authority of someone whose knowledge was demonstrated rather than claimed. Aldrich worked alongside her with the focused, almost angry diligence of a man who is learning something he should have known earlier and is determined to learn it thoroughly now. Thomas worked with them. Thomas worked with the quality of attention that young men sometimes develop when they have come very close to dying and have had occasion to reconsider the general direction of their investment. He asked questions that were specific and technical, the questions of someone building a mental model, rather than just accumulating information. Wren answered them with the patience she had given 30 years of students, the patience that finds its source, not in tolerance of slowness, but in genuine interest in what a particular mind will do with information once it has it. Other people joined. The work expanded. It was not organized in the way that Aldrich would previously have organized it, with plans submitted and approved, and contracts signed and progress measured against schedules. It was organized the way the structure on the Scorch had been organized, which was through the application of clear principles to specific conditions, adapted as the conditions required, corrected when the results indicated correction was needed. Harriet Drummond became the person who managed the practical logistics of the rebuilding, in the way that competent people who understand logistics and are willing to apply themselves to a problem become the person who manages things, which is by simply doing it until it is established that they are doing it. She coordinated the distribution of materials and the assignment of labor and the feeding of the people doing the work with the same quiet efficiency she had brought to running a boarding house, which was the efficiency of someone who has never needed credit for competence, because competence was its own satisfaction. She and Wren developed a working relationship that was built on the particular foundation of two people who have had an honest conversation about something difficult and have found that honesty was survivable. They did not become intimate friends in the way that shared experience sometimes produces. They became something more durable than that, which was people who understood each other's actual capabilities and limitations, and could therefore rely on each other accurately. The winter continued through February and into March, as Colorado winters do, with the steady persistence of a season that does not consult human preference about its schedule. The new structures that were being built on the hillsides were not complete by February. They were in various stages of construction, some of them habitable in the basic sense of having walls and a roof and a working hearth, some of them further along, some of them still in the early stages of excavation. The people of Greystone were living in whatever combination of intact existing structures and new construction, and the organized distribution of resources could be arranged for them, and it was not comfortable and it was not easy. But the fuel lasted. The new structures, even in their incomplete states, required substantially less fuel to heat than the wooden houses they were replacing. And the thermal mass that had been incorporated into even the most basic of them made a measurable difference to the overnight temperature drop that every family who had spent the blizzard in an iron stove house and understood what that drop could become, the difference was felt. It was felt in the particular way that the difference between adequate and inadequate is felt not as an abstraction, but as the specific physical experience of a night that remained survivable without desperate effort. People noted this. They noted it in the way that people note things that confirm a revision they have been making reluctantly, which is with a kind of relief that they do not always immediately connect to the revision itself. By March 17, families were in structures that incorporated the principles Wren had built into the scorch in varying degrees of completeness and sophistication. By April, when the thaw began, and the full accounting of the winter's damage and recovery became possible, the architectural vocabulary of Greystone had been substantially altered in ways that no council vote had authorized, and no plan had required. It had altered because the evidence was in the ground. It was in the thermal mass of the walls, and in the warmth of the floors, and in the green that had continued to grow along south-facing windows through the hardest weeks of the year. Evidence of this quality does not require argument. It makes its argument through the experience of the people who live with it. And the people who lived with it were the people who would build the next structure, and the one after that. On a morning in late April, when the snow was off the south-facing slopes, and the creek in the valley was running high with meltwater, and the sky above the mountains had achieved the specific shade of blue that belongs to Colorado Springs, Wren stood at the door of her structure on the scorch and looked at the valley below. It was different from what it had been in August, when she had first looked at it from this hillside. It was different from what it had been in the fall when she had watched the chimneys, sending their thick columns into the sky, and thought about fuel in winter. The differences were visible in the profile of the hillsides where new structures had been settled into the slopes, in ways that made the slopes look occupied in a manner that felt less like imposition and more like incorporation. The grid of the old town was still partially visible in the valley floor where the intact structures remained, but it was no longer the only organizing principle of the community. Harriet came up the slope behind her. She was carrying 2 cups of coffee, which she had been making each morning in the structure for the past several weeks, without anyone having arranged for this to happen. And she handed one to Wren and stood beside her and looked at the same view. Harriet said that people were talking about a name for the new community, for what they were building. Wren said that was reasonable. Harriet said that several people had suggested something that referenced the blizzard, or the survival, or the specific winter that had reorganized them. Wren said nothing. Harriet said that one of the suggestions had been Callum, the Callum settlement, that there was more support for this than she might expect. Wren was quiet for a moment, looking at the valley. She said that it was not her name that had built what they were building, that her grandfather's hands had held part of it, and older hands had held it before his, and they were all part of a chain that did not begin or end with any individual person. That naming it for her would be like naming a river for the cup that happened to be in the right place to carry it. Harriet considered this. She said she would pass it along, though she suspected people would find a way to acknowledge Wren regardless of what she thought about it. Wren said that they should acknowledge the work and the principles which would last, rather than the person who would not. Aldrich Pence came up the hill that afternoon. He had been coming up the hill regularly since the blizzard. Not for lessons exactly, though he was still learning, but for the kind of conversation that does not have an agenda, the kind that happens between people who have revised their understanding of each other and are not yet finished with the revision. He told her the debris of the Civic Center had been cleared. He told her that Eleanor's stone had been found intact, the name and the dates undamaged, which was the nature of stone when the things around it failed. He said he had been thinking about where to put it. He said he thought he understood now that the original plan had been about the wrong kind of permanence, that a building was not permanent in the way he had needed something to be, and that he had learned this at some cost that he would rather not have had to pay. He said he thought the name should go into a wall. Not a memorial wall, not a monument, but a working wall, a wall in a structure that would be used and inhabited and maintained by the people who came after, a wall that would do the thing. She was now understanding walls were for which was to hold warmth for the people inside. He said he thought Eleanor would have appreciated the practical application. Wren looked at him for a moment. She said she did not know Eleanor. He said no, but he thought Wren would have liked her. He said it in the quiet tone of a man saying something true and simple rather than something polished. She said she thought that was probably right. They stood in the afternoon sun on the south slope of the Scorch, which no longer had the quality of a place without value that its name suggested, which no longer needed that name, and they looked at the valley where a community was rebuilding itself, according to principles that had been available all along, in the ground beneath their feet, and in the angle of the sun above their heads, waiting to be consulted by people who were willing to ask. He said after a while that he owed her something he did not know how to pay. She said that was not quite the right way to think about it. He asked her what the right way was. She said he could teach what he had learned to the next person who didn't want to hear it. She said that was how things got passed forward, not by monuments, by the next person who knew something sitting next to the next person who needed to know it, and not giving up when the first attempt was refused. He was quiet for a moment. He said she had done that. He said she had tried to tell them by building where they could see her. She said yes. He said they hadn't listened. She said they were listening now. He looked out at the valley and at the hillsides where the new structures were settling into the slopes, the way things settle when they belong where they have been placed. And he did not say anything more for a while, because there was not much more that needed saying in words. The sun moved across the south-facing wall of the structure behind them, charging the stone and clay with the day's warmth, doing the quiet work it had been doing all winter, the work that did not require observation or acknowledgement, the work that simply continued because it was the nature of the thing to continue. Inside the floor was warm. It had been warm all winter. It would be warm next winter, and the winter after that, because the principles that made it warm were not dependent on any single person or any single season. They were older than Greystone, and older than Colorado, and older than the particular American century that had produced the town, and its certainties and its tragic pride. They had been waiting in the ground, and in the angle of the winter sun, and in the mass of the stone for anyone willing to ask them the right question. Wren had asked. The asking had cost her the house her husband built. It had cost her the comfortable invisibility of a woman who stays where the community expects her to stay and asks nothing that the community is not prepared to give. It had cost her a winter of hard physical labor and the sustained contempt of people who had known her for years and decided in August that they knew her well enough to dismiss what she was doing. It had given her the winter she needed to prove what she knew, not to them. She had not built it to prove anything to them. She had built it because it needed to be built, and because she was the person who knew how to build it, and because her grandfather's hands had been in her hands since she was 11 years old. And those hands did not forget. The proving was a consequence, not an intention. The consequence was that 14 people had survived a blizzard in a room that was warm without any extraordinary effort, and that the community which had ejected her was now asking her to teach it what she knew, and that the man who had delivered her doom as a civic verdict was standing beside her on a hillside, asking how to build a wall. She would teach them. She would teach them the way Silas Callum had taught her, with hands rather than words, primarily with demonstration, rather than argument, with the patient willingness to show a thing multiple times until it lived in the body of the person learning it, and not just in their head. She would teach them, because that was what the knowledge was for, not for keeping but for giving, not for proving a point but for building a place where the people who came after would be warm. The valley below was beginning to show its spring. The creek ran bright in the afternoon light. The first green was on the protected south-facing slopes, small and tentative, the kind of green that has survived the worst and is now quietly, without drama, continuing. Wren looked at it and thought about her grandfather, who had pressed her small hand against warm stone and asked her what she felt. She had said, warmth. He had said yes, and held her hand there longer, and asked what else. And she had said that the warmth was coming from inside the stone. He had said, exactly right. She had been waiting 67 years to need that lesson. She had been waiting 67 years for the moment when the knowledge her grandfather had given her would be called upon to do what knowledge is meant to do, which is to keep the people who carry it alive long enough to pass it on. She had passed it on now. The wall of the structure behind her held it. The walls of the 17 new structures in the valley held it. The people who had built those walls and lived in them through the end of the worst winter in Greystone's memory held it in their hands and their bodies in the way that knowledge lives when it has been learned through doing. She finished her coffee. She turned from the valley and went back inside to begin the next thing that needed doing.